This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Welcome. First of all, thank you for being here at 9 o'clock in the morning in the rain in Atlanta. We greatly appreciate that. This is the Queer of Color Analysis in Education. And I'm very pleased to be here. My name is Tressie McMillan Cottom. I'll be moderating today's panel. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology here at Emory. I broadly study higher education, organizations, and inequality, and so I look at equality across all sorts of social domains. So I'm actually quite excited about today's panel. It is, I think, an under-examined contribution to our understanding of contemporary stratification and inequality and how those things are being fought at the site of education. One of the things that struck me as I was reading the papers and the presentations for today is something that's very fundamental in my work, which is this idea that education has long since been a site of resistance and mobilization related to civil rights. Just about every significant civil rights act that we have tends to be fought through education, and I think there are lots of reasons for that. The panelists today will be examining that from a couple of different levels of analysis. The other thing that struck me is that while they have some of the typical things that you would expect this panel to have in common, so they're talking about identity and place and resistance, they're also talking about citizenship and authority and state in, I think, some very fascinating ways. And so I think that sort of ties this panel together. I am going to be a stern taskmaster, as I have been instructed to do, with time with the presentations. We've got 15 minutes each, because I want to leave plenty of time for what I think and hope will be a very engaging question and answer session. All right, and so I will introduce our esteemed guests today in the order in which they'll be presenting. So first of all, we'll have Rigoberto. Yes?
Yes.
Thank you very much. And they've told me to shorten the bio, so I just want you to know I'm not doing this. This is not a slight, but we wanted to leave as much time as possible to get into the meat of our talks, who will be speaking on interrogating legal discourses on the rights of queer students of color. It's from the University of California at Los Angeles. We have a slight adjustment to the official program. Andrew Campbell wasn't able to make it here with us today, but we do have Ed Brockenbrough, thank you, Ed, who will be sitting in his stead and doing a very fascinating presentation on queer students in a particular site of resistance of community activism, if I understand that correctly, yes? Then we have one of our own actually returning to us for a bit there. Jillian Ford will be joining us now officially at Kennesaw State University, who will be speaking about creating ritual for cultural citizenship in live and cyberspace, a conversation with 3 digital alchemists, and I love that term. And then Lance McCready will be bringing us home with a presentation on bullying, intersectionality, and queer youth of color. All right? And so we will get started with Rigoberto.
So this talk is part of a larger article that Ed and I wrote recently, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we were interested in the article. And so I'll be reading some parts, and then some parts I'll just kind of be having a conversation. So on February 12, 2008, Brandon McCready fatally shot Lawrence King, an openly queer and effeminate classmate at Eel Green Junior High School in Oxnard, California. King's death fueled renewed attention to the plight of queer kids in schools, sparking candlelight vigils in his honor and pleas for acceptance of queer youth by prominent figures like Ellen DeGeneres. After the initial criminal case against Brandon ended in a mistrial, a second trial in which hate crime charges were dropped resulted in a guilty plea and a 21-year prison sentence. By all accounts, King's death became a weighty symbol of the continued vulnerability of queer youth in American schools, and it was really credited as saying it's one of the worst things that's happened to queer youth since Matthew Shepard. The murder of Lawrence King also raised several concerns that generally were not considered in popular discourse on the case. In particular, there are a number of important questions surrounding the role of race and mediated the homophobic interactions that led to King's death. For instance, in light of allegations that surfaced during the court proceedings of Brandon's association with white supremacist groups, how might anxiety toward an encroaching racial difference, along with masculine and heteronormative anxieties, account for the unease that Brandon may have felt in King's non-white, effeminate queer presence? In addition to sexual orientation and gender expression, race may have also influenced the relationship between King and Brandon, and the conclusions and discussions that were made about the relationship by school officials, judicial systems, popular media, and the public at large did not necessarily account for that. So there was really no conversation about the racial components that were part of this case, which are very prevalent and yet were not discussed. So consequently, rather than constructing the King tragedy as a symbol of the cost of homophobia, we may develop a better understanding of how this tragic event came to pass and how to prevent its future recurrence by focusing on the intersections of race, sexuality, and gender expression in King's schooling experiences as a queer youth of color. And this really kind of served as a springboard for me to really ask these questions. The fact that in the media they talked about this case as it being, you know, the worst thing since Matthew Shepard, and I'll talk about the history of legislation in a second, but it's really interesting that we have this egregious form of violence that happened towards a queer youth, and it happened to be a gender nonconforming queer youth of color. So it speaks to where we are in our political system when it comes to legal protections for queer youth. I specifically focused in California for many reasons. One, I live in California, but it also has a lot of very robust protections for LGBT and queer youth, and and it's been a leader when it comes to protecting LGBT youth across in the country. So we have several laws. We have AB 537, which is the California Student Safety and Violence Prevention Act, which essentially added sexual orientation and gender expression as part of the non-discriminatory policies. So it was one of the first in the country to really outline saying that students are protected based on their sexuality and their gender expression. And then AB 394 and SB 77 became kind of a strong arm where there was a lack of implementation of these policies across school districts, and so these kind of created a stronger arm on making sure that these things were being talked about. And then in 2011, we had the Fair Education Act, which essentially created an opportunity to include the LGBT folks in history. So it mandated that you must talk about LGBT folks within the K-12 curriculum in ways that are that make sense for the curriculum at hand. So acknowledging that LGBT folks exist, essentially. And the School Success and Opportunity Act, which recently passed, which basically allows students to use the restroom that they feel most comfortable based on their gender identity, and also participate in sports that they feel very comfortable in. And so there was actually, in the summer, the folks that were against this are really trying to put it on the ballot and have us vote for it, but I think they weren't able to get enough signatures, and so it failed. So now students are able to use the restroom that they feel most comfortable in. We also have statewide organizations such as the Gay Straight Alliance Network and the California Safe Schools Coalition, which really provide, again, that kind of statewide support for queer youth in the state. And we have, 2 school districts which have some of the oldest protections for LGBT youth across the country. So California is doing a really good job on paper about protecting its queer youth. And if we use gay straight alliances in California as kind of a litmus test for how accepted queer youth are in schools. If you have a gay straight alliance, that means that at least you feel comfortable to have that space, you feel comfortable to have some sort of visibility. So if we use gay straight alliances in California as that, we see that there are about 876 GSAs in middle schools and high schools across California, which seems like a lot, but then when you realize that there's about 3,000 middle and high schools in the state, it's really only about a third of the schools have some sort of queer visibility and presence in their schools. So when I think about these policies and the fact that we still don't have a lot of representation of queer youth, a lot of representation of queer youth across the state, particularly when you do an analysis of where these GSAs are, you start to see some things that follow racial and economic lines. So we don't see queer youth presence in a lot of racially segregated and economically segregated schools. And so when we think about who these policies really affect, well, all we have to do is look at the demographics of the state of California. And the majority of students in public schools are students of color. Half of the students are Latino students. So when we think about who these laws that are supposed to protect LGBT youth are really supposed to be protecting, it ends up being queer Latino youth. They're the ones that have the most to gain from these policies because they are the largest K through 12 population in the state. So these policies that we have in place must take that into consideration, that, you know, it's not just queer youth, but specifically queer Latino youth. Securing protections for anti-bias and queer color critique. So thinking a brief history on how we got to this place. You know, Nabozny was the first case in the country that really set the standard, where Nabozny was successfully able to sue a school district based on the discrimination that he was experiencing, things from being bullied consistently to being urinated on, and the fact that administrators didn't do anything to stop the violence. And so he sued and then failed, but then appealed and won. And this case is significant because it's the first case in the country that said that school districts are liable for protecting their LGBT youth. So it set the precedent, and soon after, a lot of school districts really started implementing these policies. And so we see that in California, where we saw that after this case, we saw some of that legwork happening. In Golin versus Orange Unified School District, this also placed a large precedent because it was the first case that, that really used the Equal Access Act. And so what it did was Golin wanted to start a gay-straight alliance at his high school, and the school district was not allowing him to have one. And so he sued. And so they used the Equal Access Act in order to say that we need to have this space, because if you're allowing other extracurricular activities to exist on campus, you have to let a gay-straight alliance also exist on this campus. And the funny thing is that the Equal Access Act was originally used to allow religious groups to have groups on high school campuses. So it was really interesting that here it is being used for this case. And then Ray versus Antioch University, also in California, also holds another precedent because it was the first case to use Title IX as a form of gender discrimination that, you know, a student was experiencing. So in many ways, we look at this and we see California really has been a leader when it comes to really setting precedences for LGBT youth in schools. And so this really got me thinking. So if we think about these cases as these cases where we see this form of discrimination happening, and I want to get these voices, I want to get an understanding of like, well, what led to these? And thinking about the case between Lawrence and Brandon, what Ed and I decided to do was really kind of review all of the cases in California that have been brought forward by students against their school districts based on, you know, being discriminated against because of their gender identity or their sexual orientation. And so of all of the cases, you know, none of the cases talked about race. And so for me, that was really interesting. So reading transcripts and reading affidavits and reading all the documents that I could find, none of them actually explicitly talked about race, you know. And so we had to infer on race in these cases because we really had no signifier on it. And so of these cases, about half of them, you know, were brought by students of color. And so we then wanted to use these cases and see, well, what happened in these cases? How did, you know, the folks that were defending these students, which many of these cases was Lambda Legal, what is it that they were doing to frame these conversations in a way that discounted the racial component that potentially existed within those spaces? And so we decided to go into an investigation around that, trying to get a sense of, well, what if we apply a racial lens to this? What would we have seen? Because again, these court cases become the precedent for what policies and procedures that come later on. These cases inform them, and it's the only language that we really have because we don't have any other descriptors besides what these students are saying. So these really do set the precedent for what these policies are going to look like. And so we particularly focused on two cases, the Flores and the Ramirez case. And so we approached these through intersectionality and speculative knowledge. So we really focus on Ferguson's definition of a queer of color critique, which, you know, considers how race, sexuality, gender, class, religion, region, and other forms of difference very really intersect across social and historical contexts to generate myriad narratives of what it means to be queer of color and to produce shifting relationships among queers of color to systems of power. So understanding that relationship, that my queer of color identity to this system of power, which is this school district. Also, Harper's notion of speculative knowledge, which really relies on an analysis of legal discourses where we kind of get a sense or what we speculate might have happened. And Harper really talks about this because we've had this absence of a queer understanding of these ideas, and so speculative knowledge allows us to infer what would have been the queerness within these cases. And also, Dolores Delgado Bernal's idea of cultural intuition really informs this work. And Dolores Delgado Bernal really says that a mixture of experiences inform our understanding of how we analyze certain things. So my identity as a queer Latino growing up in Los Angeles Unified Schools, informs how I see these policies, but then also my academic work. So Delgado Bernal really speaks to the agency that we bring as individuals. So briefly going through the Flores and the Morgan Hill Unified School District case, it was filed in 2008 and it was settled in 2013 and charged the school district with being resistant or unresponsive to complaints of anti-queer bias from 1991 to 98. The lead plaintiffs were Flores and Fuentes. In Flores' case, she was consistently harassed. And some of the more obscene things that happened is that people would write derogatory things on her locker, and then they would post pornography in her locker, and then she would go to the principal and she'd say, "What is this dirt? Why are you giving this to me?" And then reprimand her for it instead of doing something about it. In Fuentes, he was severely beaten one time out waiting for the bus, that when the bus driver got there, the bus driver just left him there on the floor. Later on, he had to be taken to the hospital, and we had to eventually transfer out of that school because he felt so unsafe. So these are the kinds of experiences that we see our youth are going through. In Ramirez versus Los Angeles Unified, it was filed and settled in 2004, and it claimed that there was a homophobic institutional culture at Washington Preparatory High School in Los Angeles. Lead plaintiffs were Ramirez and Gomez. And the incidences, teachers and administrators addressing students who are perceived to be queer as faggot and sinner, so really just using a lot of very straightforward derogatory language, outing students as a form of punishment to their families, and administrators suspending students for, kissing their same-sex partner on campus. And administrators refusing to use the word gay to announce the Gay Straight Alliance meetings. So again, a very anti-LGBT space. And so a queer color critique of these, we look at the demographics, and we see that in the Flores case, the majority of the school was white, and the school district was white. So then questions that we would pose about Flores is, how do they experience the schools as racial minorities, and in what ways could racial difference account for their marginalized status and ostracism? Another question is, what was the institutional climate of the school on matters of racial and cultural differences? And how frequently, if at all, were students of color the targets of harassment and acts of violence? And lastly, did the unresponsive teachers and administrators cited in the case have a history of not only disregarding the complaints of queer students and their parents, but also of dismissing the concerns of students of color and their parents as well? So again, students of color, predominantly white school, what was their experience? In contrast, we have Ramirez, which is predominantly a Latino and African-American school, which is mostly about 90% Latino. Some of the questions that we have here are, given the politics of racial authenticity that can shape the schooling experiences of students of color, to what extent were those who became targets of anti-queer bias perceived by their peers as racial insiders or outsiders? And also, to what extent was the harassment and violence recounted in Ramirez attributed to what Collins has described as a presence in communities of color to defend heteronormative constructions of Black and Latino respectability? Again, creating these norms. So how, because the majority of the administrators were also faculty administrators of color, so how were they policing the gender identity of these youth in these schools? And so again, these are things that we should be asking because they're important to this case, because they can influence the kinds of policies that can happen not only at the school or the school district level, but also at the state level. And so why does this matter? Current cases of anti-queer discrimination and harassment neglect to account for queer youth of color's multiple forms of oppression. Policies and procedures put in place then fail to account for these differences in experience. So we must ask the questions about the intersections of identities and power that seem to be overlooked in legal discourses and queer students' rights. And California is the place to do this, I feel. The majority of students are students of color. So these policies for LGBT rights really need to, it can take race into consideration in order for them to be effective. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you very much for coming out this morning. My name is Lance McCready, and I'm an associate professor at University of Toronto. Although I have roots here, as some of you know, I actually began graduate school at Emory University back in 1992. So I was, and I've been getting lost on campus because the Emory I left is not the Emory that is today. Coca-Cola. So, Coca-Cola. So, yeah, just a little bit. I just want to tell you briefly about my background, talk about the problematic I'm working with. I often think of my research projects from a social problems perspective, key question, conceptual framework, some narratives, implications, and possibilities through queer of color analysis. And I really feel privileged to be on this panel and to be here today. I've been feeling a little sort of troubled in my current academic environment, so this is very healing for me to be here and be in dialogue with all of you. So thanks, really. So I'm a social scientist, lots of sort of study in psychology, sociology, and anthropology. I've been a youth worker and advocate in a place like MAC that Ed talked about. Also began doing lots of service, organizing, and activism in Black and LGBT communities. In particular here, I was part of a group of Black gay men who worked in Second Sunday, so this is like a homecoming to me. So it's, and I try to aspire to a kind of intellectual activism that Patricia Hill Collins describes as speaking truth to power, which is a form of truth-telling that harnesses the power of ideas toward the specific goal of confronting existing power relations and speaking truth to the people, which is also a form of truth-telling that harnesses the powers of ideas to assist people in their everyday lives. It involves talking reason, honesty, love, courage, and care, often a challenging thing in academia. So the problematic I'm working with is the whole idea of bullying. I think I, like many queer scholars of color, feel sort of alienated by a lot of the bullying conversations and the focus on bullying. But then, as you'll hear about in this presentation, the idea or the concept of bullying does run through much of the narratives with queer youth of color that I talk to. So I kind of feel like in the spirit of wanting to be on the ground, how could I really ignore bullying discourses? But I wonder if research and policymaking on bullying and gender harassment, whether it takes into account the experiences of queer youth of color. How can we represent the intersectionalities of discrimination? And kind of like Rigo's presentation, I think many of us have been inspired by the work of Kimberly Crenshaw in her seminal work on intersectionality and thinking, how can the law really take into account the experiences of women of color who've experienced domestic violence? And so I'm thinking the same way, like how can bullying sort of policies and research really take into account the lived experiences of queer youth of color? So what kinds of different space harassments do queer youth of color experience, and how can educators mobilize queer of color narratives to think through research and policymaking on bullying and gendered harassment? I'm sort of revealed some of my age when I talked about when I've been here at Emory, but many of us do remember when we actually didn't talk about bullying, but we talked about sexual harassment and gendered harassment. Then we didn't even talk about gendered harassment. We really called it sexual harassment. So it's interesting now, again, how we can talk about various kinds of violence, how it sort of erases the gender dimensions of things. So by calling it bullying, it sort of erases in name the sort of gender dimensions of violence and harassment. As you've heard, intersectionality, the idea of multiple masculinities, queer of color epistemologies, and queer color analysis. These are some of the concepts that inform my work. My approach is, in this project, is phenomenology, so I'm really trying to understand the structures of consciousness and the subjective experiences, first-person point of view of queer youth of color. I did that through doing some in-depth interviews with Black gay male youth, 18 to 29 years old. And that's just a little bit. These are drawing from my work in Canada, so there's going to be some slippage. And, you know, if you're Canadians talk about this all the time, about the slippage between Canada and the United States. People in the US don't care about Canada, so they never talk about the slippage. But what, basically, but I mean, one of the interesting things here, I don't really have time to get into it, but we might get into it in our conversations. There's a lot more diasporic consciousness as a result of sort of the multicultural ideology in Canada. So here, when even I put up there, you know, in terms of status, like refugee status or Canadian citizen or South African, Trinidadian roots, and, you know, it's interesting how even when I tell people that I'm in Canada, sometimes I hear more about the diasporic connections in their families, where when we lived in the United States, we never talked about that. So just something to think about. Emerging sort of, themes that came out of this work. I think amongst some educators, there's the belief that for Black gay male students that they are actually higher achievers because they don't get targeted and stigmatized as a result of expressing a traditional form of masculinity. I once asked a group of heterosexual identifying Black men, what are some of the qualities of gay people? And they said they read a lot. And I didn't quite understand that, but that kind of says something about how academic achievement is thought to be a gendered thing, and that and a sexualized sort of thing. It has something to do with sexual orientation. So there is a kind of a belief, but I think it's interesting, and at least this, when you talk about sort of Black gay male youth from working class and sort of poor backgrounds, that there's no difference in sort of these same challenges and levels of achievement. Most of them only had their GED. Little or no relationships with adults in school. They experience bullying and harassment for being gender nonconforming, Black, or both. And there is also, I think you'll hear in this, and I say being Black, I should also talk about the shadeism that has run through sort of a number of my narratives with youth. And this kind of relates to this area I'm interested in terms of emerging adulthood, or if you buy into the belief that one of the aspects of adulthood is sort of finishing your education and sort of gaining stable employment. One of the things that Ed and I have talked a lot about is sometimes the whole idea of finishing your education or getting an education is put on the back burner in the quest for self-acceptance and self-esteem. So that's something else that we might want to talk about. So here are some of the narratives. This is Darryl. My name is Darryl, white mom, no baby daddy in the picture. I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, AKA I was the only Black person in the school. In the graduation picture in grade 6, I was the only one with the fro. Everyone had white or spiked hair, flat. So there was this whole thing of adoption that people were throwing at me, and racism. And all the kids picked on me because I was Black, or when summer came, I got tanned and I ended up darker than my hair color. All you could see was my teeth and eyes because of the native part of my heritage. And it's just, so many things going on here, right? I didn't say I was gay until about grade 12, but everyone knew because I'd always bring a boyfriend along somewhere. They took me out. Grade 9, I was like, whatever. I just didn't respond. People would push me, shove me. They tried me in numerous ways. So there, in that narrative, again, you see sort of race, shadeism, gender-based harassment running through that narrative. Here's the one. Another student in my class told me that I was too black for her to play with, so she went to play with the Indian chick kids, even though she was darker than I was. So a lot of internalized racism that was going on at the time in elementary school. So it kind of didn't help my self-esteem. So no matter what my mother, her friends, or other family members tried to enforce or encourage in order to boost my self-esteem, you spend 8 hours a day at school, and those 8 hours kind of destroy the 4 to 5 hours you have with your parents before you go to bed. Okay, that was the one, I'm sorry. And then Ronell, school. School for me was the most dramatic part of my life, because at the time of school I was very feminine, and it was a struggle for me. For the class, the majority of them were girls. There were always 10 boys. There were around 10 boys in the class, and it was always a back and forth with us, especially with me because I'm the only feminine guy at class of 10 boys and 20-something girls. It would always be a battle, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I would always be in a quarrel, or it would be this. If I was to say to the teacher, I'm going to go to school, I'm going to go to the washroom, she would turn around and tell me, or are you going to change your pad? Ooh. So this is what I would have to go through. Again, here seeing sort of the gender harassment that's kind of going through these narratives. So I want to, so again, just to reiterate my main point, when I've done work with queer youth of color, and so I've done in-depth interviews with queer youth, observed, spent time, you see like lots of harassment on a lot of different bases, right? Sometimes for the clothes they're wearing, which is really a class-based sort of harassment. Sometimes it's gender-based harassment. Sometimes it's shadeism for being biracial or being light-skinned. Sometimes it's being darker-skinned, right? So there's a lot going on. So my thought is, working backward, I'm always trying to work from a youth perspective. Okay, if you put these narratives and these experiences at the center, what does the bullying policy and the resources look like? Can they really address the multiple forms of harassment and discrimination these youth are experiencing? So let's take a brief detour to another sort of perspective and look at just really broadly the anti-bullying policy in the US. If you kind of look at the stopbullying.gov website, which is a federal government website managed by the US Department of Health and Human Services. And on that website, they define bullying is unwanted aggressive behavior among school-age children that involves real or perceived power imbalance. The behavior is repeated or the potential to be repeated over time. Both kids who are bullied and who bully others may have serious lasting problems, yada, yada, yada. Bullying includes actions such as making threats, spreading rumors, attacking someone physically or verbally, excluding someone from a group on purpose. And then here, in terms of imbalance in power, kids who bully use their power, such as physical strength, access to embarrassing information, or popularity to control or harm others. Power imbalances can change over time in different situations, even if they involve the same people. Schools and communities that respect diversity can help protect children against bullying behavior. However, when children perceived as different are not in supportive environments, they may be at higher risk of being bullied. When working with kids from different age groups, including LGBT youth and youth with disabilities or special health care needs, there are specific things that you can do to prevent and address bullying. So all that's to say is, there's not a lot of deep discussion or discourse or even gesturing to specific forms of power imbalances based on race, class, gender, sexual orientation. There's this attempt to sort of offer some sort of generalized understanding of bullying. And does that sort of generalized understanding really serve the needs of queer youth of color who are experiencing specific and multiple forms of of harassment? So I just, let's move towards, I think the Toronto District School Board is kind of legendary in having a very inclusive policies. They have this equity policy that no teacher knows where it is. But it does name, it does name sort of race, class, gender, ability, sexual orientation, and sort of that's a step up from many sort of equity policies. At least they name all these different forms of social difference and try to provide some curriculum for it. So here it says, bullying is a form of repeated, persistent, aggressive behavior. Bullying occurs in a context where there are real or perceived power imbalances. This is from the TDSB bullying prevention policy. Here's interesting. Students may attain or maintain power over others in school through real or perceived differences. Some areas of difference include, but are not limited to, size, strength, age, intelligence, economic status, social status, solidarity of peer group, religion, ethnicity, disability, need for special education, sexual orientation, family circumstances, gender, or race. I'm like, okay, that's at least a step up. At least it names all of these. You know, that there's something in there we maybe get, and this is sort of the emphasis, I think, in Canada, a certain sort of discourse around inclusiveness. Like, they will name social category. They will name differences. And in the US, often there's not as a focus on naming all of these, right? So I find that interesting. And also it says bullying intervention, a comprehensive and effective response to bullying incidents takes into account and considers all parties involved in the bullying incident. It should provide specific support for the student who has been bullied, intervention for the student who was bullying, and strategies for responding to students who are directly observing the bullying incident. So that in some ways leaves some room to get at the specific experiences of queer youth of color. But I still kind of find that unless you name some of these experiences and represent the experiences of queer youth of color, there's a lot of slippage that can occur in the policies, and there's a lot of invisibilizing that continues to go on. So through the eyes of queer youth of color, bullying does occur at the intersection of multiple forms of discrimination and oppression, and it's difficult to take this into account through the current approaches to bullying prevention and intervention. So how did those, and I don't think intersectionality was even mentioned in either of those two policies that I discussed. So how can we do that? So one thing is to reframe bullying policies and research with intersectionality as their foundation. Why don't you start with intersectionality? Why don't we try that? We can make space and to be more inclusive and democratic and inspiring through centering the ways of knowing of queer youth of color, centering those queer youth of color epistemologies. This builds on stuff that's been said across all the papers. Embracing the complexity of experiences. Oftentimes when you try to throw intersectionality and multiplicity at sort of educators and policymakers, they say, look, I need a red button or a green button. You're complexifying it too much. And I think we need to embrace the complexity. And then third, exhibiting a kind of strength. And I think this is a larger discussion, but both Patricia Hill Collins and Kathy Cohen have talked about exhibiting a kind of strength in orienting programs and interventions really cognizant of your relation to power, really trying to build programs and interventions around those who in society are perceived as less powerful, right? And so I think rather than trying to frame things in terms of the mainstream or sort of our universal student, right? If we oriented and we kind of rewrote those programs from some of the most marginalized, quote unquote, within society, we might come out with something very different. Thank you.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.